Well, I'm glad we were set up before. Let's come to the 34th presentation in this series of a year. We're doing a strategic laving each week, each 7 days, so that there is the sense of a grouping by resonance. And when you have a grouping by resonance, all of what would seem in a linearity as repetition becomes a kaleidoscopic expansion that is available for a harmonic analysis. In mathematics, if one can do a harmonic analysis within a theory of groups, you begin to have a penetration below what was to the mind previously a unity that could not be broken down any smaller. The atom became subatomic in the late 1920s, early 1930s, largely because of an advance in mathematics. In 1928, Hermann Weyl published his theory of groups, and it moved the entire understanding of logic and mathematics into what has, in retrospect, been called the quantum world. The ability to look below unities is not to fracture unities, but to fraction, to be able to go into sub-unity proportionalities so that one can begin to have ratios which together then in groups, in sets, set theory being the precursor to group theory, set theory coming from Bertrand Russell, group theory from Hermann Weyl, and the development in its application through such geniuses collected around Niels Bohr as Erwin Schrödinger and Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Paul Dirac, etc. This group in Copenhagen was the group that developed the entire quantum world, where a complementarity of subatomic symmetry was the most penetrating, and now by the early 21st century, almost a century later, we understand that there is a unlimited sourcing of the limited computational capacities. The discovery of the confirmation by experiment of a theory that posited the Higgs boson, which was characterized as condensed vacuum, has a direct bearing on the mathematical computation for theory and further experiments to understand that we can go into a fertile vacuum which gives an emergence to particality and to energy in wavelet frequencies, and that they together have a symmetry. And that this symmetricality can have what the mind thinks as an infraction of the rule by a breaking of symmetry. And this infraction in the mind of the idea of a broken symmetry is at the core of mystical misunderstanding in civilization. The simplest example of this is for the mind to conceive of a patterning like yin-yang as a symmetrical complementarity, and that this would be then the ultimate sourcing, the oneness of that pair. And when this was first presented in Chinese thought by Zhuyan about 350 BC, the yin-yang chia in Chinese is school. The misunderstanding that came out of this spawned two great geniuses in Chinese thought. One was Mencius, who brought back a refinement of Confucius. The other was Chuangzi, who brought into play a refinement of Lao Tzu. Both of them understanding that more primordial, more sourcing than yin-yang is Tao Te for the Taoist, for Lao Tzu and Chuangzi, and that the sourcing of Zhen-Yi, the heart comportment with the symbolic structure of thought of Confucius. Confucius not only wrote the Analects, which is the Zhen, the heart wisdom, but also wrote the commentaries, the 10 wings, as it were, to the I Ching, which is the understanding of the symbols. The symbols and the mythic heartfulness have a pairedness that pairs with the ritual emergence of existence and the Tao, which is the zero field nature, so that the entire pair of pairs can be characterized as a frame of reference, better as a square of attention, as I've been using for the last several generations, of nature, ritual, myth, symbol, and that this square of attention has the ability to go infinitely within, which is in a continuity with the infinitely without of the square of attention, of the frame of reference. The integral mind can only work with the geometry of the frames of reference, whereas the developments of quantum mechanical mathematics, as in Hermann Weyl's theory of groups that we began with, as with the developments of Schrödinger and Heisenberg and Wolfgang Pauli, not to mention Bohr himself or Paul Dirac, all of this led to an understanding that one can go deeper than unity and one can expand scalars into infinity beyond that integral as well. All of this was a heritage that now is able to be recognized in a kind of a new past, leading us to a very, very bright future, because we understand now, can understand, that all of this was the central wisdom that was passed on in ancient Alexandria, and that wisdom in ancient Alexandria goes back to an emergence as a carrier wave of civilization about 2,000 years ago. One of the great problems of the modern world, problem areas, aside from the difficulties of East and West, of China and America, of India and Europe, aside from that, one of the great problems in the world is to be able to understand Islam. And it is what we are looking at now to make an expansion of the time forms of civilization to include Islam. It is important for us in the early 21st century to be able to have the ability to expand out of the square of attention, out of the frames of reference, so that we exceed referentiality and we are able to dissolve the limitations of attention to an attentive field. And that attentive field is well known in terms of the great realizations that have happened with our kind over many thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands of years. To rediscover is to go back and bring that new past back into play in such a way that there is a recalibration of civilization, that all of the snags and hooks, hesitations, errors, gaps, missing, corrupted, skewed, all of this recalibrates itself as one brings that new past into play in terms of the true expansion of the presence, not the present moment, not time that is cut by a now into a then and into a coming. This is the essential assassination of reality in terms of an individualization of time as a now of an individual who wants it now, whose planning is a planning of redoing what has been in terms of what they intend their plan to be of what will come. And all of this is on a nightmare level when there are crises in the time forms of civilization. There are minor storms, there are major storms, and then there are hurricanes, there are typhoons. We live in the grand mother of all typhoons in civilization currently. Nothing false is going to stand, is not standing, hasn't for some long while now. And rather than face a bleak wasteland ending, it's better to have a realization that recalibrates and brings every promise into play. When Islam spread in that first generation from Muhammad, it was the most dynamic, powerful vision on earth at the time. And within that first generation, the spread of Islam was akin to, and note this, the tremendous success of the Islamic State, ISIS, in Syria, Iraq, just a month or so ago, of not only sweeping in a conquest, but sweeping because those who were supposed to be arrayed surrendered. gave over their equipment, their money, stepped aside. And it was like the parting of the Red Sea for Moses. It is a powerful vision that splits the tenacity of the structures that the mind, in its hubris, in its false pride, has thought that this was in play when something else was in play that stole the energy and ignored the fences, the borders, the mores, and just swept through. Islam did that. And finally, in 642 AD, reached Alexandria and swept into Alexandria and took over all of Egypt, which lay down for the conquering entree into the old world city that was laying fallow, but in that fallowness was still the residue, the remnant of its great apex of wisdom, some almost 6.5 centuries before, the genius that was there some 4 centuries before, influenced almost immediately the development of a wisdom realization in Islam, first in 642, because they found that the structure of European thought was misplaced, that the early medieval world of the Western world was based on an incredible pastiche that had been pasted together by a false glue that would become brittle in time, and indeed by that time was indeed brittle. And the realization for the Islamic conquering generals and wise men advising them in Alexandria realized that a false scholastic form of Aristotle had been co-opted by a corrupt structure of the Church of Christianity, and that this had over time molded for about 300 years a false world, and that it was a house of cards, and that it could be walked through, and which they, by and large, did. In the next couple of centuries, Islam spread from Portugal to India, to Indonesia. They walked through like shards because they knew the way to see through, to carry their theoria, their contemplation, in between all of the so-called structures, and to use their ability to have a consciousness that was differential, to be able to literally ignore the glue in between these shards. And so it not only fell apart, it almost, one could say, it evaporated. There was a 2-step that followed that immediate realization that they, in Alexandria, 642 AD, had come upon the key of what had made the greatness of the West in the first place, and had been corrupted and a false realm pastiched together. The second move came in the grandchild generation about 70 years later in Jerusalem. Jerusalem by that time, for many, many centuries, had been not only destroyed and laid waste, but the only way that one could live in that area was in the mountains surrounding. And in those mountains, a young Islamic prince named Yazid, we recognize the name as the root source of a people called the Yazidis, who were just rescued by the tens of thousands because the current corrupt Islam, the Islamic State, was seeking to kill the Yazidis because they were not of the same jihadi, corrupted Islam which they are imitating, the original push of the Islamic vision. And so a very interesting translation of a manuscript published by Brandeis University and the University Press of New England in Hanover, New Hampshire, published in 1982. The Revelations, the title is A Testimony of Alchemy, being the revelations of Morianus, ancient adept and hermit of Jerusalem, to Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah, king of the Arabs, of the divine secrets of the magisterium and accomplishments of the alchemical art. And this changed the great vision of Islam into a realization that they were not just penetrating through a corrupt structure of the West, but that they were engendering the original creative imagination that had made the West tremendously great, and that they indeed were then the inheritors of what had been set aside as being irrelevant was actually exactly what was now important. And what was the core realization at the time was that the whole genius in Alexandria was pinpointed on Hellenistic Judaism, on the merging of the Greek language in an Egyptian setting of a refinement of several thousand years of a Jewish tradition leading back. At the time, the emphasis was on Abraham. And the realization was that Abraham had, before he had the son Isaac, that the patriarchy of Judaism is passed through, his previous son was Ishmael. And that Ishmael was born of Hagar, who was an Egyptian who the Islamic invaders saw as one of them. Now that they had the home front, the home city of the way in which all of this played out, and the realization came in waves that there was a whole group, there was a whole set of sons of Abraham other than Isaac, akin to Ishmael, because Abraham had children by several women. He had a child, two children actually, Joseph and Benjamin, by Sarah. And then there were children that came into play. Hagar's son Ishmael, but he had a third woman. Her name was Ketubah, and Ketubah had 6 sons by him. The daughters were not kept track of. And those 6 sons were the sons who populated the whole landscape into which Ishmael was sent in exile. So that there were 7 sons that grew up to be the population of people that now was the vision of Islam. And that foremost among those 7 sons, one of the sons had descendants from the time of Abraham, who produced the wife of Moses. And that the wife of Moses then was of this Arabic lineage, of this Abrahamic Arab lineage, which was not the single writing hubris of a patriarchy of Judaism, but was the broader, huge family of the other 7 sons of Abraham. And so one had in the Islamic original vision a tremendous sweeping realization that the falsification of the sons of Abraham was at the core of what was wrong with the Judaism and was assumed to be the basis upon which Christianity had been a reformation. And that now Islam was come as a fresh vision to clean house, to take out the infidels, because a later prophet from Moses, Muhammad, had brought a new vision. Now, in the time forms of civilization we've been looking at, it's germane to introduce the fact that the reference wave that was very powerful in between the 2 aeons, Abraham and then 0 BC, 1 AD with Jesus. Jesus in Alexandria, to be specific. Jesus in Alexandria and Mary Magdalene, to be very subatomically specific. In between those 2, there was a reference wave. And the reference wave always precedes the carrier waves by about 350 years. So that if you go at the middle of 2000 BC and then 0 BC and go to 1000 BC, which is David and Solomon, but go back 300 years to 1350 BC, you come to Moses. And if you go then the 2,000-year Aeonic period, which was de rigueur of Alexandrian wisdom in Hellenistic Judaism, and Jesus, and Mary Magdalene, you come to 650 AD. So that from Moses to Muhammad is the reference wave of civilization. And what Moses delivered in the Torah and backed up in the Torah, not just from Genesis in the beginnings of Exodus, but the other 3 books of the Torah that come into play, especially Leviticus, and then Numbers, and finally added later and pieced together Deuteronomy, but especially Leviticus, which is the law of God applied to his people. The way it is spelled out, meted out in great detail. I'll bring next week the Anchor Bible edition of Leviticus, which is huge. It's very thick. So that Torah of Moses was replaced by the Sharia of Muhammad. And for those people who had just taken over Alexandria, and were expanding across northern Africa. They would take it over in the matter of the next generation and reach all the way across the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain, and reach across Spain and Portugal into France, and were only stopped by a relentless, self-sacrificing courage. A French general nicknamed the Hammer, Charles Martel, stopped them in France. And that was the first time that they had been stopped. This left a very interesting kind of a realm. One of the realizations was that if Alexandria was such a brilliant place, there must then be a hidden understanding in Judaism which would have been tapped at the time of Jesus. And if one could look at the subatomic structure of the vision of Jesus, one could be able then to see that something here, mysterious though it is to us currently, has to do with not only prophecy, which is like the prophecy of Moses and then the prophet Muhammad, but the carrying of that, the carrier wave of that, reference wave, the carrying of that had to do with a secret refinement of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And what came out took about 250 years to refine. And when it was refined in the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid. Yes, our Baghdad. The leader of ISIS, of the Islamic State, styles himself as al-Baghdadi because of this. When we come back from the break, we will see that the refinement of this in Baghdad, in the time of Harun al-Rashid, was the Ikhwan al-Safra, the brethren of the purity, the true purity. Let's take a little break and we'll come back.